destructive effects of archaeology. So Rachel, if we could go to the next slide. Yes, okay, good. All right, bit of geography. When I used to teach history and geography, I used to joke that teaching history was hard. You had to study hard books and know your stuff. Geography was easy. You just read the newspaper once a week. You knew all you needed to know. So this might be a little bit easier to... we've just gone through a fairly in-depth and detailed idea of what history is and some things with archaeology. So let's get into some geography now. So the geography of the Bible lands, and that's basically it, maybe a little bit more. The Near East is dominated by a number of geographical features. The most important of these are the mountains running down the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So we're talking about mountains that are here, run out about there. So Hebron's there. So when I say mountains, some of them aren't very high, some of them are very, very high. These mountains are decisive because they decide where the rain falls, and that decides whether civilizations prosper and which ones are great and which ones are not so great. So the mountains catch the rain from the west off the Mediterranean Sea, comes through that way, gets caught, runs back through the rivers, or gets caught here and becomes part of the Euphrates or the Tigris, which also gets other rain. So it's no wonder those are such large rivers. Tigris and Euphrates, they flow across Mesopotamia in a southeasterly direction down into the Persian Gulf, as you can see on the map. The Persian Gulf's down the bottom here. So they're not quite parallel, but there's always an area between them. That's where that word Mesopotamia comes from, between the rivers. Now, next slide please, Rachel. On a map, the combined effect of all these rivers makes the land look like a green crescent shape. Sort of. Yeah, all right, boomerang. We call this the Fertile Crescent because these areas are fertile and the bit under it, the Syrian desert, is not. In ancient times, travellers, merchants and armies moved up and down these areas looking to take advantage of the fruitful conditions. We know about one of these travellers, Abraham's journey from Ur to Haran and then down into Canaan. He followed the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent wraps around the top end of the great and inhospitable Syrian desert. Next slide please, Rachel. Looking more closely at the main part of Israel, the land west of the Jordan, it's basically made up of two vertical strips. You have the coastal strip, which is flat, and then the interior, which is hilly. And so the Canaanites, they dominated the coastal flats with their iron chariots, and the Amorites dominated the hills with their walled cities and their giants. Both Jerusalem and Bethlehem are in the hill country. The Sea of Galilee in the north empties into the Dead Sea along the Jordan River. Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. Now that entire strip there is below sea level, which is quite unusual. East of the Jordan, the semi-arid plateau is good cattle country. The coastal strip, good for farming, and the hills are good for running sheep and goats.
What's that whole strip? Is it the Jordan Rift?
Yes. I think it's called the... We will talk about this.
Okay.
It's the word has slipped my mind. Yes, it is a rift. The earth is literally coming apart. It goes all the way down the Red Sea and into Ethiopia. We will look at that, so we might just wait until we get there. get to? Oh yes, there's seasonal rivers called wadis that come across from the east into the Jordan and the Dead Sea. And the Sea of Galilee is 212 metres below sea level, and the Dead Sea is 430 metres below sea level. To the north, the land is fertile because it's watered by the snow melts off Lebanon. So this is the most fertile region, I think, of all of Israel as far as farmlands go. You look at pictures of the Jezreel Valley, where the Battle of Armageddon will be fought. I mean, Megiddo is a site on the perimeter of the Jezreel Valley, and Armageddon just means the Battle of Megiddo. This is where kings always fought. The Egyptians fought the Hittites and the Assyrians, and they all fought there. It's just a good place to have a battle. But it's wonderful farmland, very green, very, very green. To the south, the Sinai Desert begins to encroach into the areas to the south of Beersheba. So the Sinai is here, and these areas are arid, or semi-arid at least. In the southwest corner, the technologically advanced Philistines seized and held onto a pocket of land where they built their 5 strong cities. Today, this area is called the Gaza Strip. It's watered by the Wadi Gaza, which is the headwaters, which has its headwaters near Hebron, and then meanders down to the coast, producing swamps and wetlands along the way. So Hebron's about here, and the Wadi Gaza goes to the coast there. Part of the British invasion of Palestine in World War I saw troops getting stuck in the Wadi Gaza. And Australian light horsemen hung around in lots, I think, in the Wadi a little bit further up in their campaign too. All right, next slide, please. Civilizational centres of the Old Testament world. So let's look at what the great civilizational centres were, and we'll see the other people that affected Israel. First one is Mesopotamia. This is the great cradle of civilization, and you can see it on the map there. Meso in the middle, Potamos, Greek for river, so the land between the rivers. And in the scriptures we see that this is where those that came off the ark and their descendants decided to settle. And it makes sense. It's got a lot of water. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers provide enough water for large-scale crop farming. Now, this is the basis of all powerful societies. You may not have realised this, but to be a powerful society, you need large-scale crop farming. When the majority of people are growing their own food or hunting or whatever, the population increases flat, technology stagnates, armies are difficult to muster, even more difficult to maintain. Where there is a stable supply of abundant grains, populations boom. Now this occurred with the Industrial Revolution only a couple of hundred years ago. The British population was stable, very stable, up until 1750, and then with the new technology came increases in crop farming and population increases, and it all took off. When this happens, people can specialise and build expertise. Technology experiences rapid advancement. So this was the story of Mesopotamia for the 3,000 years after the flood. And within a short space of time after the flood, the Mesopotamians had divided into a northern civilization, the Assyrians, and a southern civilization. So Ashur and Nineveh, these are the Assyrian cities, main cities, and Babylon and some of these others. These are the Babylonian. There's Chaldees, Babylonians. Both the Assyrians and Babylonians took turns at dominating the Near East. That's a bit of a flippant way of saying neither of them dominated all the time. Throughout much of Old Testament history, with great resources and advanced technologies, they were formidable conquerors. Big populations, lots of skill and technology. It's no wonder that their neighbours could not withstand them. Yep, the Egyptians are there. The Egyptians were a great and powerful civilization for similar reasons. The Nile did what the Tigris and the Euphrates also did. It provided the water to grow the crops, which increased the population, allowed for specialisation, technology, and the Egyptians were very powerful. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and it enjoyed the population growth which massive harvests of wheat tend to bring. So the Nile, which we can see in this picture here, along the banks, the banks would be flooded, the inundation of the Nile every year, and the crops would be grown, and especially in the delta. This is where the Israelites settled in the time of Jacob, and it was good land because of the Nile Delta. Lots and lots of water. Like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians enjoyed great riches, advanced technology and military strength, and they were formidable conquerors throughout long periods of ancient history. The Egyptian armies were very powerful for a very, very long time. When the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians were drawn into a test of military strength, this usually occurred in the no man's land in between the two mighty civilizations. Have a look at it. You've got Egypt here, Mesopotamia here. What's in between? Canaan, Israel. And we call, next slide please Rachel, we call this in-between area the Levant. Just means the raised lands. That's a French word, Levant. It covers modern Syria, Lebanon, Jordan and Israel, and it was the mixing bowl or the melting pot of the ancient Near East. So it's the land bridge between Europe and Asia and Africa. It was home to a multitude of nationalities and language groups in ancient times, and often highly contested territory. The Egyptians and Mesopotamians campaigned there regularly, and other smaller nations and empires also fought many battles in the Levant. Many of these battles are in the Bible. Next slide please, Rachel. That's the last one. Okay. Which one did I miss? Can you go back please? That one. Okay, that's one I want now. Thank you. All right, the Mitanni, based at the apex of the Fertile Crescent, even eclipsed the Assyrians for a time. The Mitanni Empire was here, and they pushed in on the Assyrians here, took over Nineveh and pushed in on Ashur, and were eventually driven back. The Hittites, we see the Hittites in the scriptures. Their civilization was based here, but it pushed down all the way into Canaan and down to pressure the Assyrians at times. As there always is with these sort of things, there are ebbs and flows of military might. So sometimes one civilization is stronger, sometimes it's another, depending on many things, depending on the brilliance of the military commanders and depending on all sorts of things. The Hittites had a number of successes over the Egyptians. One notable success was over Ramses the Great, which Ramses rewrote as a victory for him. But the fact that he took off and the Hittites got to stay where they fought suggests otherwise. It's no surprise the Hittites are referred to regularly in the Old Testament. Israel, of course, had moments of greatness under Joshua, David and Solomon, but generally the Israelites were dominated by these other empires. Now there were other groups as well. Philistines, Ammonites, I should point these out. So, Philistines, Ammonites, where are we? Canaanites, Edomites, Amorites, Moabites, Amalekites, and Midianites, Arabs down there. They all laid some sort of claim to areas in the southern Levant at some point during Old Testament times. They all come into the narrative somewhere, don't they? Book of Judges or wherever it is. Also on this map we can see the kingdom of Elam in what is now Iran. And the Elamites were an important early civilization that kind of disappeared from history, being replaced from the north by the Medes and the Persians. The societies of this area were often dominated by the Babylonians until the 6th century BC, where the Persians and the Medes turned the tables and the Persian king Cyrus conquered the Babylonian Empire. And he and his successors went on to build the greatest of the ancient empires thus far. They were much bigger than all the rest that had come before them. And then they in turn were conquered. Darius was conquered by Alexander the Great. And his empire was huge, but very short-lived. Now, interesting thing about the Persians, they're seen as the great bitter enemy by the Greeks in their portrayals of them. But in the scriptures, the picture is much more sympathetic because the Persians treated the Jews very well. And we see things like the Cyrus proclamation at the end of books of Kings and in Ezra, and also the story of Esther as two well-known examples of where the Persians favoured the Jews. Now, you might have wondered, how do we know what year date things occurred? Has someone been keeping track all these years, and has somebody given us all the year dates? Well, the knowledge of all historical dates is constructed off the back of dates and time spans which are already known. The Greeks and the Romans provided the medieval European scholars with a very solid chronology of historical events which occurred from about 700 BC through to about AD 500. So between them, the Greeks and the Romans, their chronology was solid. In turn, the medieval scholars, starting with a monk in the 6th century AD called Dionysius Exiguus, which roughly translates as Dennis the Small. I think it's actually Dennis the Lesser, as in lesser well known, because there's always a greater and a lesser in these things. So the other guy was better known, the other Dionysius. Anyway, he provided excellent chronicles, he started, but other scholars as well, of the Middle Ages. So by the end of the Middle Ages, we had good Roman and Greek records and good medieval records because of what the monks had been doing. Dionysius Exiguus was also the one who began counting years as before Christ and Anno Domini, not after death. Anno Domini, Latin for in the year of the Lord. Before that, the main system for numbering the years was to count the number of years from the foundation of Rome, which was 753 BC. Modern scholars have built on the foundation of the medieval scholars. Modern scholars have also succeeded in bringing together the chronologies of the Greeks and Romans with the annals of the East, which is the records of the Egyptians, the Assyrians, Babylonians and the Persians. And these records have been dug up from the ruins of ancient archives in royal cities. Now, when we say archives, you're probably thinking paper. These ancient archives in Egypt, Assyria, Babylon and Persia are either stone or clay. The clay rolls that the Babylonians, Assyrians and the Persians used seem to be some sort of stamp. So a proclamation would be given, a roll would be made, or a number of rolls probably, and then they'd get something like an animal skin or some sort of papyrus, and they'd roll out the proclamation with ink, and then the messenger would take that to wherever it's supposed to go. And when they'd done with that particular roll, they'd put in the archive for future reference. And so that's what's been found. These rolls have been found preserved because they're hardened clay, baked clay, they last. The Egyptians tended to use stone more often, but clay and stone are present in all these places. So the writing is usually imprinted on clay cylinders or tablets, which is the reason they survived, by cross-referencing events which are referred to by the record keepers of different empires. So if the record keepers of the Assyrians talked about the same event as the record keepers of the Babylonians, say a battle or whatever it was, the death of a king, you can cross-reference between this archive and that archive and start to build the picture. So we know about battles, the reigns of kings, and then the known historical chronology gets extended further and further back, beyond even 2000 BC. Now, here's the important bit. Because the records of the Assyrians, Babylonians and Persians reference the destruction of Samaria and Jerusalem, Samaria in 721 BC, Jerusalem in 586 BC, now we can tap into the biblical chronology because we have lists of kings and their ages right back to Saul, king of Israel. So from Saul in about 1100 roughly down to 586 when Jerusalem is destroyed, we have year by year exactly what's going on with Israel. So that's a further extension of the chronology. Then as I've already said that, books of Kings and Chronicles contain the lengths and the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah. The dates of the Bible timeline can be established and extended with a certain amount of precision back to the coronation of King Saul in about 1095 BC. Now it's at this point where the dates of the biblical timeline become a little uncertain. On the surface, the times of the judges has a reasonably precise chronology covering 410 years plus 40 years of Eli fulfilling the role of judge. But scholars do think there's potential room for interpretation. It's not my view, but I can see what they're getting at. What they say is there may have been some overlap between various judges. We see the judges as one after another. They think that some of them may have been concurrent. I've got some views as to why that's probably not the case, but it's an interesting idea which would collapse the time of the judges from 400 odd years down to about 215. Keep that in mind. We'll get back to that in a minute. Likewise, there's much discussion about the exact length of time when the Israelites were in Egypt. Now, this one's an interesting one because what does Genesis say? What did the Lord say to Abraham? That his descendants would be in Egypt being afflicted for 400 years. Now, if you read through the genealogy, it doesn't seem enough generations to cover that 400 years. We go from Levi, who went into Egypt, and then his grandson is Amram, the father of Moses. So within 4 generations, they're out. And to stretch that over 400 years is a bit tough, especially when we're given the ages, the longevity of those people. It doesn't cover 400 years. So we have to think again, what exactly are we being told about 400 years? Is it supposed to be from when they went down into Egypt? And even then, they weren't afflicted straight away. They were well received for a while. So what are we down to? 180, 200 years of the 400? Where's the other half? There are some ideas about that. And like I said, clear genealogies are given in the scriptures which seem to indicate that Moses' mother, Jochebed, was a literal daughter of Levi. So through his mother, we go Levi, Jochebed, Moses. Does not seem like enough generations to cover 400 years again. Exodus 21, let's have a look at that. Exodus 21 and actually we'll just do Exodus, not 21, Exodus chapter 2 verse 1. Also Numbers chapter 26, 59. And there's also Amram's genealogy. Now, this is why the genealogies of Chronicles are important. You can't just skip the first 8 chapters of First Chronicles in your reading. You've got to read through. There's lots of details in there that are important. Doesn't matter if you're bored. You need to read it. Exodus chapter 2 verse 1 says, "And there was a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi," and we go on to see this is Moses' mother. Now, is she a descendant of Levi, or is she actually a daughter, as in what we would think of as a daughter? I suspect that the latter is correct, which makes us wonder, where does the 400 years go? Now, one way we could interpret it is that the 400 years began when Abraham went into Egypt, because Pharaoh took Sarah, and the time frame's about right. So maybe God in his mercy counted the years differently than what we've been thinking. If we look at Old Testament prophecies and New Testament descriptions of the time span of the Israelites being under Egyptian rule, and the time span from the Exodus to the building of the temple, and there's a number of passages which are called the chronologist's nightmare, because it's very hard to make them all come together. It's not about there's an issue with the numbers, it's a matter of we just don't understand how it all fits together. We don't have a full understanding of the context of the spans of years mentioned in these passages, and therefore misinterpretation through ignorance is easy. So let's have a look at a couple of those passages. Exodus chapter 12 verse 40. That says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years." So some of that would have been when they were treated well. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1. "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." And then 2 New Testament passages. Let's go to Acts chapter 7 verse 6. "And God spake on this wise," this is to Abraham, "that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and they should bring them into bondage and entreat them evil 400 years. And Galatians 3:7, this will be the last one. Oh no, I've got the wrong verse. All right, we'll leave that one there. There are some other verses too. Oh no, it's 17, that's why it's wrong. "And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect." So that's an interesting verse. That says that 430 years after the promise was given to Abraham, the law was given. That's quite interesting, isn't it? 430 years after Abraham received the promise, Moses was on Sinai. Now that doesn't look like 400 years from Levi to Moses then, does it? So that's my view, that God started counting from Abraham, not from when they went into Egypt. However, I'm not going to say that's a doctrine because that would be foolish. Let's just say that God sometimes counts things differently. His imputation is always gracious towards his people, and perhaps in his mercy God cut the time in Egypt short, realigned the counting. It was still 400 years, 430 years, depending on which point you're taking. It's also possible that, as I said, when the counting started when Abraham was in Egypt. Now, similar problems arise when we try to determine the length of the time of the judges. The perspective of all of the relevant Bible passages are not clear, so we don't have a definitive answer on this one. Most Bible commentators have worked their way through this conundrum, and to a man they do one of two things. They either put forward a short time period for Israel in Egypt, so that comes down to maybe about 200 years, or they put forward a short time period for the times of the judges. So, speaking very generally, either the time in Egypt goes from 400 to 200 years, or the times of the judges goes from 400 to 200 years. My preference is for a short time period for the Israelites in Egypt, as it seems to me to fit the biblical accounts the best, but I can't prove that. Whichever choice is made has implications on trying to date the events in between, i.e. the Exodus. The identity of various Egyptian dynasties which the patriarchs interacted with, the identity of the Egyptian dynasties which Moses interacted with, the dates of the Exodus, the giving of the law, the invasion of Canaan, all hinge on the answer to this conundrum. It seems that the Lord has deliberately confounded our attempts to line everything in the Bible up with the great figures and civilizations of ancient history. It's not like God would ever sort of put his people aside, put the people of God aside, and break that connection between them and the rest of the world, and make it very difficult to try and line up who was where when. We see that in other places in the scriptures too. Why is this? Well, the Lord wants us to operate by faith, not by sight. He doesn't want us to go, yes, I see it all. It's all there in the history book. It's all there in the Bible. It all matches perfectly. He wants us to be in a position where we have to believe one or the other, because we operate by faith. Interestingly, after attempting to sort through all the difficulties in the chronology from the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, right through the time of Moses and Joshua and the judges to Samuel, most scholars tend to converge on similar dates for the lives of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Then the Bible provides a simple list of genealogies which go all the way back to the creation in about 4000 BC. So we tend to agree a date for the creation, somewhere around 4000 BC. We tend to agree down to where Jacob goes into Egypt, and we tend to agree where the time of the judges ends. It's this bit in the middle which has a fair bit of controversy. So when we give a date for an event in that time period, we're going to say we think it was about. Now, one more thing before we go. There is an alternate set of dates. The Septuagint, an ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, provides another set of numbers for this chronology, which gives a date for the creation of about 5500 BC. However, before we get too excited, we can be sceptical about this particular setup, considering that the earliest copies we have of the Septuagint, the copies which are used to make the printed copies that you buy at Koorong, are none other than Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Funny that. The manuscripts behind the modern Bible versions. Now, they've been proven to be severely corrupted in the New Testament. Are we going to trust them in the Old Testament? That would be foolish. When the severely corrupted nature of these manuscripts is kept in mind, it would not be wise to believe that they contain the correct Old Testament text. So you might hear people sometimes talk about the Septuagint having the right numbers and everything fits, but just remember where they got that one from. Obviously, there were Greek translations before the time of Christ. There were probably translations of the Old Testament, or parts of the Old Testament, all over the place. In the 7th century BC, there's quotations in Spartan poetry. The verse from Numbers about vengeance is God literally says this in Spartan poetry. Vengeance is God's. So obviously they had some access to the Old Testament. Probably in the time of Solomon, the Old Testament was probably dispersed all over the world. But the Septuagint, as we know it, comes from post-Old Testament times. It was the manuscripts we have were put together in the 4th century AD, and we know where they came from Egypt, and we know what happened there, and so we would be wise not to trust them. All right, let's finish there, and as I said, that'll be the most technical and academic of all of these lessons. We'll get into the Old Testament itself next week, now that we've laid the foundation of how we're going to approach it and why we do that and why we don't do other things. And we'll start with the creation first up next week. Let's pray as we close, and then we'll head off. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness. Thank you for the scriptures and for the understanding you give us. And I pray as we study these passages from a more historical perspective, that we'd see things we haven't seen before, and that we'd develop more and more of a knowledge of your word. In Jesus' name.